Hi, everybody. We're going to do a quick review lesson on ecological succession, focusing on primary and secondary succession within an ecosystem. So, ecological succession. What is this? What does succession mean? Right? If we're talking about Queen Elizabeth II, succession is who comes next or what comes next, right? So the line of succession for the royal crown would be Prince Charles and Prince William, Prince George, right? So that's our line of succession. Now, if we turn to talk about biology, it's a little bit different. This is a similar meaning. When we talk about ecological succession, we're talking about this series of developments and changes that happen to an ecosystem, one after the other. These are steady, predictable changes of an ecosystem, which change is good, change is always happening. Now, whenever we're talking about change within an ecosystem, ecosystems are always working towards their climax community. A climax community is where they're going to have their most mature, longest growing plants, where you're going to have the largest amount of biodiversity. And if we're talking about, for example, in Michigan, our climax community, our Maple Beach forest. So if we see large forests full of maple trees and beech trees, we know that we're probably in a climax community. If we were to go up to northern Michigan, you're going to see a lot of evergreens because that is a boreal forest. And so its climax community is going to be a boreal forest. If we go out to the middle of Nebraska, to the grasslands, we're going to see that their climax community is a prairie community with lots of different grasses and wildflowers and small brush and animal species that live within that ecosystem. So a climax community is the peak community for that specific ecosystem, but it is not permanent. Ecosystems are constantly changing due to different influencers. When we talk about ecological succession, we are talking about two types of succession. The first one is our primary, means the first organisms that land in an ecosystem is our primary succession. This happens where there is no ecosystem before, where whatever ecosystem there is we're starting fresh. We're starting with new, with nothing. For example, an environment after a volcanic eruption. Another example would be as a glacier melts away, where nothing is left but the bedrock or the ash and the volcanic rock. We're just starting with nothing. Okay. In that primary succession, we're talking about that there is the first ecosystem moving into that area, primary succession. What happens first in primary succession is that soil is formed within the bedrock by weathering and erosion, by things like mosses or lichens, very small organisms that come in and break the soil down, add a little bit of organic material, and then other species move in. Other plants, grasses, shrubs, trees eventually move in. Secondary succession is the one that we see most commonly. Secondary succession is when we have an ecosystem that has been disrupted, the climax community that has been disrupted by things like clear cutting in forestry, wildfires, taking forests and turning them into farmland, or grasslands and turning them into farmland. Things like in the Amazon and rainforest, for example, millions of acres have been clear cut to make room for cattle ranches. In the United States, we have 1% of our original prairie grasslands that have been converted into agricultural land. So what happens when these changes to these climax communities are allowed to come back, when whatever factors are keeping them from their climax community, when those influences go away? For example, when human activity goes away, a farmed field is no longer farmed. What's going to happen over time is the ecosystem is going to recover a second time. It's going to come back. That's secondary succession. Again, primary succession, we take a look right here. We have starting from nothing. You're starting from bedrock. And some of the first organisms that move in are lichens and mosses that will grow and attach themselves to the rocks and will break down, use the acids within them to break down the rock into soil, which then would be a great place for other plants to move in and live. One great example is Mount St. Helens that blew in 1980. In 1980, over the last 30 years, has been able to recover through primary succession much of the land that was destroyed. We talk about secondary succession. For example, if we, at our soccer field at the end, what if we stopped mowing? What if we stopped spraying for weeds? What would eventually happen? Well, we'd expect that grasses would start to grow, wildflowers and small bushes and shrubs would move in. Of course, they would eventually grow. Some of those earlier plants would be outcompeted by some of the trees, and eventually we would return to that climax community that was once here before it was interrupted. Forest fires are a great example of cases in which secondary succession comes through after a wildfire. Here at our school at Canton Prep, I took a little picture here of the side. Over here to the left, you can see where human activity has changed an ecosystem, right? If you notice, if you look to the left, very little biodiversity, one species of grass, it's all mowed down. But if we look to the right, where the ecosystem has been allowed to recover, where it's not being touched or changed by human activity, we see a recovery of species. There are at least 17 different species of small plants. Here, there are about 8 to 10 different species of small trees that are starting to come in. And so we would expect in secondary succession, were this to be left alone, that it would return back to a mature forest. So this is just a quick little review of primary and secondary succession. Remember that primary succession is where we are starting from nothing. You are coming in and starting fresh with the primary ecosystem, moving into that area. Secondary succession is an established ecosystem that has been disrupted by either natural changes or non-natural human activity and is returning to, and will eventually return to, with no interference, will return to its climax community. All right, thank you.